Disproportionate representation is when children from a particular group experience a certain situation that others would expect them to have, based on the group's representation in the general population. Disproportionality can be displayed through overrepresentation or underrepresentation. It happens to students with learning disabilities, emotion behavior disorder, and autism spectrum disorders. Disproportionate representation in students with learning disabilities may be due to the public's perception of learning disabilities. The Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation discovered many misconceptions while conducting their GFK-Roper study. The study was conducted in 2010. The first misconception is that teachers and administrators believe that learning disabilities are a product of the home environment in which children are raised. Another is that 7 out of 10 parents, educators, and members of the general public link learning disabilities with intellectual disabilities and autism. According to the National Center for Learning Disabilities, many Black and Hispanic students are misidentified as having a learning disability, while many white and Asian students are not identified at all. In 2011, California qualified 3% of Asian students, while the percent of total school enrollment was 11.2%. This is considered underrepresentation. Also in 2011, California qualified 11.3% of Black students, while the percent of total school enrollment was 6.8%. This is overrepresentation. Each state has its own problems regarding over and underrepresentation. Minnesota had a better percent proportion of qualified Asian students to total school enrollment. Minnesota qualified 5% of the 6% total school enrollment, but Minnesota had a similar problem misidentifying Black students. Minnesota had qualified 14.8% of Black students, while the percent of total school enrollment was 9.2%. Despite districts across the nation reporting this information, the U.S. Census survey-based data reveal little differences between whites, Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. This statement could be an indication of why students are not getting the proper identification. Despite the United States discussing and researching why disproportionate representation is happening, researchers have not found the causes. However, from these discussions, a new form of monitoring has since replaced IQ testing. It is called a response to intervention. According to the National Center for Learning Disabilities, the response to intervention, abbreviated RTI, is a multi-tiered approach to help struggling learners. It helps to closely monitor the student's progress at each stage of intervention to determine the need for further research-based instruction. Unfortunately, studies researching the effects of the RTI have not been found to decrease representation. The current theories as to why disproportionate representation occurs include the following ideas. According to the California Department of Education, one idea is that general education teachers do not know how to effectively educate children from diverse backgrounds. Another is the misuse of tests. A third is that many children from minority backgrounds do not have access to effective instruction or sufficient educational resources at school and at home. Disproportionate representation in students with autism spectrum disorders is highly debated. Generally, white and Asian students are overrepresented in special education. In contrast, Black, Hispanic, and American Indian students are underrepresented in special education classrooms. According to a study completed by Northern Arizona University, California is very close to the generalization for overrepresenting both white and Asian students in the autism category. On the other hand, both California and Minnesota show to be close to underrepresenting Hispanic students. This disproportionality may be due to the lack of additional autism certifications states require teachers to have. This disproportionate representation has caused many court cases regarding civil rights. In California in 1984, Larry P. versus Riles is a court case that was filed against the state of California by African American parents. They argued that biased standardized intelligence tests resulted in the disproportionate identification of African American students as mentally retarded. The outcome was to ban the use of IQ tests and order the elimination of overrepresentation of African American students in educable mental retardation programs. Another civil rights case was the 2004 amendments to IDEA. These amendments included that the students' team use instruments that are validated and technically sound. The team must also take into account the reading instruction definition from No Child Left Behind. These amendments are an answer to the criticisms found in Larry P. versus Riles. The amendments to IDEA in 2004 determined the requirements for states. They are as follows. States must have policies and procedures designed to prevent the inappropriate over-identification or disproportionate representation by race and ethnicity of children with disabilities. States must provide for the collection and examination of data to determine if significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring. If significant disproportionality is thought to be occurring, the state must provide for review of policies, procedures, and practices. The state must disaggregate data on suspension and expulsion rates by race and ethnicity. And lastly, the state must monitor their local education agency to examine disproportionality. There are many implications for today's special educators. One is that both general and special education teachers will need to be prepared to work with diverse student populations. These educators should take continuing education classes that address disproportionate representation. They should also take classes that address how to properly identify a student with a disability. Another is that students with autism are diagnosed through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Text Revised version 4. This can cause variability that results in variability across the states. Researchers have found that once students are labeled as disabled, it can have long-lasting harmful effects. Today's educators need to be more aware of these implications and try to avoid them. In addition to a student being labeled as disabled, once a student receives special education services, the student tends to remain in special education classes. Educators need to understand that students may need their educational services increased or decreased after their original placement.